Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Ardalyst webinar series. My name is Richard Roberts, Solutions Architect here at Ardalyst. I want to thank you for joining us today for the CMMC-Ready Security, how M365 GCC High security tools protect your organization. Today, I am joined by Ardalyst Solutions Architect Gabe Corsini. He's going to be diving into the CMMC Security Ready position of Microsoft GCC High. During this presentation, feel free to submit questions. They will be addressed during the Q&A session if we don't get to them at the time you submit. And when that happens, essentially, we'll be able to get back to you at a later date, after this webinar, to be able to answer those questions if we don't get to them today inside of this session. One of our representatives will reach out to you because this webinar will be recorded and will be shared with you at a later date. And then if you don't get any questions in or you aren't able to get them in before the webinar ends, please send an email to marketing@Ardalyst with that question, and we'll be sure to get a representative to answer that one for you. So enough of the intro. Let's get started. I'll turn it over to Gabe Corsini.
Awesome. Thanks, Rich. Is my audio okay?
Yeah, I can hear you good.
Great. Awesome. Well, thanks everybody for showing up today. I really appreciate it. Like Rich said, my name is Gabe Corsini. A little bit about me. I started my career in IT through the U.S. Navy. I served in the Navy in active duty for 10 years as an information systems technician, doing all sorts of various system administration and cybersecurity work. Ultimately, ending my 2 years in the Navy with the at Naval Network Warfare Command in the N365 Cloud Operations Division, helping the Navy do its largest migration from our legacy infrastructure on-premise to Azure and Microsoft 365. I ran the enterprise service desk there and also was one of our solutions architects working with different key mission owners throughout the Navy to help modernize some of their legacy systems and bringing them into Azure, Microsoft 365, especially from the security and someone on some of the compliance and data perspective as well. Joined Ardalyst back in 2023 to kind of continue that mission and bring that to scale with customers who are seeking CMMC compliance and are trying to work within the defense industrial base and work with the DoD and are looking to find ways to not just comply with CMMC, but also protect their environments and their personnel. So today's focus for the most part is going to be around the specific Microsoft 365 security tools. We will spend a couple of minutes at the beginning talking about CMMC basics and why Microsoft 365 GCC High is kind of the perfect environment if you're looking to comply with CMMC, especially CMMC Level 2. If you're curious about more on that topic, we do have a previous webinar, which you can find. It's probably posted on our LinkedIn page, and it's also on our YouTube as well. We have a recording from that webinar you can go back and reference, where we dive a little bit more deep into Microsoft 365 GCC High as a CMMC compliance platform and why that's really a kind of a key resource in your tool belt. So today is mostly focused on the security and compliance piece and some of those tools that you can leverage to that end. Kind of talk a little bit about who we are. So we've been delivering cybersecurity services since about 2013. 90 years of combined cyber operational experience and 100 years of combined Microsoft experience. We're a Microsoft partner. We're also a registered provider organization, or RPO, with the Cyber AB. And also, we are defense contractors ourselves. Ardalyst Federal, our sister company, is a defense contractor, has to comply with CMMC, and has several defense contracts that they're actively engaged in as well. So this is an area that we're very, very familiar with. It's something that means a lot to us, and it's a big part of the reason why now we're trying to help organizations get CMMC compliant, because it's something that affects us too. So we spend a lot of that energy trying to see if we can give back to the larger community. So let's talk for a few minutes, just kind of get a baseline here about what CMMC is, what the different levels are. We'll talk about Microsoft 365 as well in a minute. So as everybody here is hopefully familiar with, if you're not, that's okay. CMMC 2.0 is a cybersecurity compliance framework that was established by the DoD, and it helps standardize and enforce the protection of sensitive defense information, or as we commonly refer to it as CUI, or controlled unclassified information. CMMC 2.0 aligns with all of the practices in NIST SP 800-171, and it's usually comprised of about 3 levels. So there's CMMC level 1, which is foundational. This is the basic safeguarding for federal contracting information. So the information that comes in on your federal contract, making sure that you can protect and safeguard that data, and only requires a yearly self-assessment that you are complying with that CMMC level 1 practices, which is, just makes up, I think 17 of those practices, and requires that annual self-assessment. Level 2, which is the advanced level, and is what probably affects the majority of the population in the CMMC environment, or those who have to comply, has a 110 practices that align with the NIST SP 800-171. It requires an initial assessment to get compliant with CMMC level 2, excuse me, that's what I meant to say. It also requires an annual self-assessment stating that we're still compliant with those controls. And then every 3 years, you have to get another C3PAO or a third-party assessment from an accredited assessor. And then you have CMMC level 3, which is that expert level, which is going to take those 110 controls from that align with the SP 800-171, as well as practices based on the SP 800-172 for those advanced safeguarding of CUI, and will require every 3 years getting that government-led assessment. So not a third-party assessment, but a government-led assessment to make sure you're complying with level 3. Per the DoD, and this is a statistic I think Rich can speak to as well, DoD has estimated that the majority of customers, or a majority of folks who are working with the defense industrial base, will need to comply with CMMC level 1 or level 2, and then a very small subset of organizations will likely need to comply with CMMC level 3, and that's usually right now kind of reserved for the prime contractors, the very large prime contractors, I should say. So, but it is good to know where you might fall into that scenario. Quick overview on Microsoft 365 GCC High when it comes to CMMC. There's a couple of key features that I think are really important when you're considering, GCC versus GCC High. Which one do I need? Some of those key features include the compliance standards that GCC High has made readily available. One, it's a FedRAMP High environment. So you can see that in the FedRAMP marketplace. It has met all of the strict requirements to be FedRAMP High and has an SSP that goes with it. It's also accredited to handle ITAR data, to do DFARS compliance, and is DoD SRG level 4. It's also commonly referred to as impact level 4, which is just saying that this is certified by the DoD for to be able to protect and handle government data at that specific impact level, which is usually CUI specified, which is any CUI that has a specific controlling requirement set forth by the responsible body. It has a strict data residency requirements. So not only is the data all stored within United States sovereign data centers, which is really important when you're talking about CUI specified, but also Microsoft personnel who are acting in support of GCC High are U.S. citizens with additional background checks. So you're only going to work with U.S. citizens whenever you put in a ticket for GCC High due to those data sovereignty requirements. It's got quite a few use cases to include being designed for use by federal agencies, contractors handling highly sensitive data, and controlled unclassified information, to include specified categories like ITAR and nuclear, which we know for a fact has very specific controlling requirements. GCC High is able and has the compliance standards necessary to be able to handle categories like that. So if you have a CUI specified category, if you're doing more than just CUI basic or FCI, you need to be in GCC High for that reason. And it has a lot more enhanced security features and some stricter security requirements. Some features available in GCC are restricted or modified in GCC High to meet higher security requirements. So while GCC High kind of typically lags behind in some of the cutting edge features that Microsoft 365 Commercial or Azure Commercial are getting announced almost daily or weekly, it does have those stricter security requirements to be able to comply with all of the strict DoD requirements that you need to, especially when you're talking about CMMC level 2. But you're going to miss out on some of those latest and greatest features. The average delay time is 6 to 12 months before those features are delivered to GCC High. But As we say here in the bottom note, those are kind of the cutting edge features. So some of the super advanced features of Copilot, for example, Microsoft Copilot's their AI tool. Those might be a little bit behind than what you might see in commercial, or for example, and this is one that, it hurts me every day, but we're waiting on it, is Entra Global Secure Access, which is the SASE or SASE solution that Microsoft has come up with that's built directly into Entra ID. Well, that's available in commercial and works great. It's not yet available in GCC High as it has a stricter authority to operate process it has to go through with the DoD before it can be delivered into that environment, because we need to make sure that it's able to protect that government information, especially for customers who are trying to comply with CMMC. So that's at the forefront of Microsoft's mind when they delay these features, making it to GCC High. This is just a really quick diagram, and I think it's really important to highlight a couple of items here. When we're talking about CMMC level 1, you can see here we're commercial and GCC high. Or GCC are great for CMMC level 1 and FCI, but as soon as you start talking about CMMC level 2 and level 3, you'll notice here this caveat for GCC, and you might not be able to read this, but it says CUI specified is not suitable for GCC in this regard. It requires US sovereignty. Microsoft 365 GCC does also operate on the Azure commercial network. So that's what's part of that suitability requirement, is it can't guarantee US sovereignty when you start talking about complying with CMMC level 2 and handling different types of ITAR or EAR and no foreign data. If you meet any of these CUI specified requirements, you're automatically getting jumped into GCC High, because now you're in that Azure government network and you're in a US sovereign cloud, and we can guarantee that when it comes to data protection requirements. So this is just a really important part to hold off or to check out on. Obviously, there's some other items here about the SRG levels or the FedRAMP requirement as well. But when it comes to CMMC level 2 and level 3, if you have specified data, you have to be in GCC High. So that kind of starts to wrap it up here in some of our GCC High requirements. The real key factors when you're considering this is, do you have that DFARS 252, 204, 7012 requirement in your contract, which would require that you safeguard CUI? Is it CUI specified? And are you already in Microsoft 365 and looking to maintain some feature familiarity and experience continuity for your organization? If you're answering yes to at least the first two, or potentially all three, then GCC High is the perfect cloud for CMMC level 2 and for CMMC level 3. Now we're going to kind of get into the part of, okay, that's great. So now we have chosen GCC High. We're going to go put all of our data in there. What are we going to do to secure that? Before I move on, Rich, are there any questions already that we need to answer?
Yeah, you got great timing. There is a question in there. The question that I have here is, does Microsoft 365 GCC High meet all the CMMC level 2 requirements out of the box?
That's a really good question. I think this is something that comes up a lot, especially when we're talking to customers, is like, if I go stand up a tenant and I put my CUI data in there, am I good? And it's kind of a nuanced answer, but to be blunt about it is no. Out of the box, it does not do that. It has all of the data requirements it needs by being FedRAMP high and having that DoD impact level 4 sentiment to be able to protect CUI. But if you're talking about complying to all of the practices, especially the practices in CMMC level 2, it has all of the tools you need to comply, but those tools do need to be configured to meet all of the practices and the assessment objectives therein to comply with CMMC level 2. And there are certain things that, depending on how you set up your organization, GCC High isn't going to do for you. When you start talking about media disposal or physical security, or even, personnel management with stuff like background checks, GCC High is not going to handle those items for you. And those are items that you have to consider when you're talking about your holistic CMMC level 2 program. Those are things that we address with our test track program here at Ardalyst. But to go back to the original question, the answer is no. Out of the box, it's not compliant, but it has all of the tools and features to be compliant because of the types of statuses and compliance it's already gone through with the DoD. So I hope that answers your question. If not, please feel free to submit another question to follow up on that. Any other questions, Rich, before we move on?
No, that's good. That was a question that came in.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right, so let's start talking a little bit about the GCC High security features, and this is where I start to have a lot of fun because security is kind of my bread and butter, and this is where I have a lot of fun every day. So we're going to split this up into two primary categories. There's three features I primarily want to touch on today, which is Microsoft Sentinel, the Microsoft XDR, Defender XDR. It was previously called Microsoft 365 Defender, and then Microsoft Purview. All three of these features I think are really important, especially when we're talking about, protecting our personnel, protecting our organization, and also protecting our data. And then there's three supporting features that I want to touch on a little bit that I think are also very crucial and do have security components, but are not strictly security components. That's Microsoft Intune, which is Microsoft's device management solution, so it's their MDM product. Entra ID and conditional access. So that's Microsoft's identity manager with conditional access, which is kind of the security tool that we use to manage access to the environment. And then Microsoft Defender for Cloud, we'll touch a little bit on, okay, managing personnel, managing email, all this other stuff is great, but what if I have infrastructure, virtual machines, Kubernetes clusters, or something of that nature? That's where kind of Microsoft Defender for Cloud comes in. We'll talk a little bit about that. So to kind of kick us off, we'll talk a little bit about my personal favorite tool, which is Microsoft Sentinel. If you've been around the system administration environment for a while, or maybe you're coming from a legacy on-premise environment, you might be familiar with the idea of a security information and event management system, or a SIM, or a SIEM, depending on what part of the world you're in. This is where we're going to collect and analyze log data from a ton of different systems into a centralized location. Microsoft Sentinel is Microsoft's cloud native SIM, where we can aggregate log data from across various different platforms, whether it's the Microsoft 365 platform, and we're collecting all of our data from there, or from Entra ID, from Intune, or maybe from another third-party system like AWS, Google Cloud, on-premise Windows or Linux devices, firewalls, you name it. There are a lot of ways to collect and aggregate logs into Microsoft Sentinel and analyze that log data to look for potentially suspicious activity. What makes Sentinel even better is that second part of that first statement, which is security operations, automation, and response platform, or a SOAR platform. Not only can I collect all this data and investigate it and create events or alerts, or to use what we call a naughty word, incidents inside of the Sentinel platform to identify potentially malicious activity, I can take automated response on all of that activity as well by creating something called a playbook to do automated incident response, especially if I know based on the data that's come in that there's an easy or automatable solution that the Sentinel can take for me on my behalf, and kind of reduce some of the need on me as an analyst or an engineer to now go manually respond to a variety of different events. So some of the key features that Sentinel has is real-time threat detection. So as alerts are coming in, we have a variety of different types of alerts that we can create that will alert us when something's going on. So we have near real-time alerts, or fusion alerts, which we talk a little bit about, I think, in the next slide, that will take in the data, and as soon as it collects that information, it's going to run an alert query to say, does this meet some sort of alert standard that I have set up in the environment? And if so, I'm going to create an event for it and prompt my analyst or prompt my automation to take action on this event. We can do automated incident response through what's called Sentinel playbooks. These are essentially no-code or low-code automated responses that we can take on different types of alerts. So I can connect an alert to a playbook and say, every time this is triggered, do this thing. And it can be as simple as, excuse me, just go and get me additional information about the IP address in this alert, to, hey, I don't, this activity, this was a brute force attack on someone's account. I want you to lock this account down, or require additional multi-factor authentication, or notify someone specifically that we have something malicious that's potentially happening live right now in the environment. There's a lot of different variety of playbooks that we can create to help automate some of the response to these alerts. It's integrated monitoring for GCC High and Azure Gov environments. So I'm collecting information from Microsoft 365 products, as well as across my different Azure environment, whether it's Entra or whether it's something with my infrastructure. I can bring all that into one place and I can ingest those logs from various different sources and help correlate data across sources, which we'll talk about in a minute. Um, when we're talking specifically about the benefits for CMMC, um, there's a couple of practices that Sentinel is really, really valuable for. That's the AU, IR, and SI control families. So this is centralizing log data, auditing our logs, and performing continuous monitoring across the environment to make sure that nothing malicious is happening. Excuse me, I want to take a quick sip of water here. Um, One of the other great benefits of Sentinel is the ability to provide reporting to demonstrate compliance during an assessment. And this is something we just experienced with a customer that we just helped pass an assessment recently, where we were able to bring up Sentinel and not only show like, hey, here's events that are actively happening. We were able to trigger an event so we could show it pops up in Sentinel. We can investigate that data and here's the data involved. But we can also show here's a workbook where we have a dashboard of different information coming in. Here's some playbooks where we have some automation that's taking place. So Sentinel is really great, especially during a live assessment of showing that kind of compliance. When we start talking more about CMMC alignment, one of the cool things about Sentinel is that logs are all being ingested into a log analytics workspace, first and foremost. Log analytics workspace is just a log aggregation that Sentinel sits on top of and provides the continuous security monitoring features for. Log analytics is going to make sure that these things get parsed, and then Sentinel is going to take the alerts rules, the analytics rules that we create, and help us identify potentially malicious activity. Sentinel also has a really cool feature called the Fusion engine. Fusion is a machine learning platform that Microsoft has created where it can take logs coming in from different sources, let's say Entra ID and SharePoint, and it's going to help correlate. This is something that's kind of suspicious on Entra ID. Here's something that happened near this activity with the same identity over in SharePoint. Let me put this information together and see if we can identify something even, potentially malicious that's going on. And it's going to help trigger that. And then we also, like we talked about previously, the automation rules supported by Azure Logic Apps, where we can trigger activities based on different alerts that are coming in and take action on them. So it's preventing the need on a single or a small group of analysts from taking manual response efforts on every single alert that comes in. Sentinel can integrate with a variety of the different Microsoft tools right out of the box. There's also a very large community of third-party tools from a lot of vendors like Cisco, Palo Alto, and more, allow you to integrate with some of their platform as well to get logs into Sentinel. So you're not just monitoring your Microsoft environment, you're monitoring your entire organization. Wherever there's a log that can be created, it can probably make its way into Sentinel. And again, it can support compliance monitoring and evidence gathering through the audit log correlation process. So that's kind of Sentinel in a nutshell. Rich, do we have any questions?
Yeah, there is a question on this topic on Sentinel. I don't know, maybe it's a little further ahead, but the question is, what's the relationship between Microsoft Defender, XDR, and Sentinel? And should I use both?
Uh, to answer the second question first, you should absolutely use both. So the relationship there is kind of bilateral, right? So Sentinel itself, its primary job is to ingest logs from sources using the log analytics workspaces, bring a bunch of log data in, and then analyze the log data. And it can do everything from across the Microsoft ecosystem to third-party sources as well. Um, Microsoft XDR, which we're going to talk about next, is specific to the Microsoft product. So this is Microsoft Defender for Office 365, for mail, Defender for endpoint for make sure we're protecting all your physical or virtual devices, Defender for identity for specifically monitoring identities, not just in Entra, but also your on-premise identities if you have an on-premise Active Directory environment or your hybrid. What's really cool is Microsoft has integrated a lot of this together. So one, by connecting the Thunder XDR to Sentinel, I can bring all of the alerts from the XDR into Sentinel so I can see everything in a single pane of glass. And it will tell me that, hey, this alert for this potential malware on an endpoint is coming from Defender for Endpoint through the Microsoft XDR connector. So it's lets me kind of create this single pane of glass for all this information. On the other side of that is Microsoft has gone and made it possible to, if you're an organization that maybe just has one Sentinel workspace, if you're not a very large organization, you can you can connect your Sentinel workspace to the Microsoft XDR portal. So as I'm going through and looking at alerts in Sentinel inside the XDR portal and says, hey, here's something that came in from Defender for Endpoint, I can now just click on the Defender for Endpoint tab and go look directly at that device. Where Sentinel will still give me a link to the security portal where all of the XDR tools live. If I'm already in the XDR portal and looking at Sentinel inside of the XDR portal, I just have another click of a button and I'm exactly where I need to be. So there's a lot of great integration between the two products, but you should absolutely use both because as soon as you start talking about bringing in logs from on-premise devices or firewalls or other third-party clouds, you really want to make sure you have Sentinel up and running because that's where you're going to get a lot of the benefit from bringing in those third-party tools because you can leverage a lot of those third-party connectors or connect them yourself and do some of the manual work to bring that log data in on your own, which we spend a lot of time doing. So yes, in short, you should absolutely use both and they're very tightly integrated. Anything else, Rich?
Oh, that's it.
All right, let me go back and cool. All right, speaking of, let's talk a little bit about Microsoft 365 Defender, also now called XDR Suite. Let's do a little bit of an overview. So XDR, as some of us might know, stands for Extended Detection and Response. And the XDR Suite integrates several different products all together into one place. So that's Defender for Endpoint, Defender for Office 365, Defender for Cloud Apps, and Defender for Identity. So Defender for Endpoint is all of your device security. That's protecting your devices. That's running your antivirus and other malicious protections. It also integrates with Purview, which we'll talk about shortly. Defender for Office 365 is email protection. If I have mail that's coming into my environment, I want to make sure that I'm protecting my users, whether it's phishing, potential malware, you name it. Defender for Office 365 is the one that's going to handle that. Defender for Cloud Apps is specifically for cloud app security and usage auditing. So that can be first or third party cloud applications that are connected to your Microsoft environment. So if you're doing single sign-on, for example, to QuickBooks Online, you can leverage Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps to protect access to QuickBooks Online. But really, what's one of the big benefits for Defender for Cloud Apps is in session monitoring. When we set up environments to protect organizations who have users who might be logging in from a web browser. One of our key scenarios there is, maybe I have contractors who are sitting on site with the government, but they need to log into my Microsoft 365 environment to check their email or interact with a company SharePoint site, etc. Using Defender for Cloud Apps and session monitoring, I can protect the access when they log in from an unmanaged or unsecured device. Yes, it's a government device, but it's not managed by me and my organization. I can protect that environment in that login session to make sure that data doesn't leave my environment to go into a machine that I don't have access to or I'm not managing. So Defender for Cloud Apps is really, really cool. Defender for Identity is the other product there. That's a lot of on-prem and cloud Active Directory or Entra ID security monitoring. So that's really focused on what is the identity doing? Is that identity sensitive for some reason, whether it's logged as a VIP or it has privileged access, and what's going on with that identity from a day-to-day basis and monitoring for how it's being used. More benefits here for CMMC is automated incident detection and response. A lot of the XDR suite can be set up to take action on your behalf and then notify you afterward. Hey, I took action and this is what I did, rather than wait for me to go in and take action on something. You'll see a lot of times today the gap between when a phishing email arrives and when an incident might occur can be relatively small. All it takes is for a phishing email to come in and someone click that link. If we're not setting up the XDR to take automated action when that phishing email arrives to begin with, we are increasing our exposure to a potential incident by not having something automated. Go ahead and just remove that phishing email from the environment or send it over to quarantine, or at least test the link inside that email to make sure it's even malicious to begin with. So the other part is it simply simplifies and speeds up threat management process. We've talked a lot about that. It's going to spend a lot of time simplifying into a single portal something has happened. Here's all the things that are involved. Here's what you need to do about it. Um, when we start talking about specific CMMC alignment, though, and this is where I wanted to kind of break out some of the practices that some of these different tools are involved with. So, Defender for Endpoint, system and information integrity, malicious code protection, really, really key on to the 3.14.x practice family, right? Defender for Office 365, also 3.13.1 and 3.14x, that whole practice family as well. Defender for Cloud Apps, really big on 3.1 as is Defender for Identity, and then 3.14.x, and then Defender for Identity 3.3, right? So you could see how some of these tools start to map directly back to some of these CMMC practice families and how they can be really instrumental in helping you to meet the compliance requirements for these different families. One of the key features that the XDR has tried to solve is by creating a unified view to manage threats across your environment. By having a single portal where all of the different XDR tools are living kind of together and we can see alerts across the XDR in one place, we simplify that view. Where we talked about Sentinel being a single pane of glass, it absolutely does that as well. XDR, though, if you're not used to using Sentinel, or if you're strictly in a Microsoft 365 environment, you're not using any third-party tools, perhaps leveraging the XDR's native unified view or unified portal to handle a lot of the management of that process might make a lot more sense across your environment. And again, demonstrating compliance inside of an audit, and whether it's a CMMC audit or or incident response audit, having that XDR tool set up, configured to help process information, to help create alerts, to help do that incident response process. Not only is a CMMC assessor going to see this and be able to see we're taking action as things happen, if you do have to engage in an incident response, you have one place that you have to go look to start trying to figure out what happened, when did it happen, and what are we going to do about it. Any questions before I move on to Purview, Rich?
There is a question here. The question is, what kind of support or documentation is available specifically for GCC High security configurations?
That's a really good question. So a lot of the Microsoft documentation, it's also called Microsoft Learn, is really kind of the source of truth for how do you do initial configuration for any of these tools. If you want to learn to set up the tool to do a specific function, the Microsoft documentation is always going to be the source of truth. The time you have to really concern yourself with GCC High specific is if you're looking for how to set up a specific function and the Microsoft documentation is pointing you to somewhere in the portal that isn't apparent to you or doesn't appear to exist. And that might get back to the feature parity discussion that we had kind of at the beginning, where GCC High lags behind a little bit in some of the cutting edge features that commercial might be receiving right off the cuff, right? When it comes to CMMC specific documentation, a lot of that kind of depends on which assessment family or which assessment practice family you're trying to meet or a specific objective you're trying to get down to, and how you're mapping each of these tools to that assessment practice or assessment objective. With a Tesseract program here at Ardalyst, we spend a lot of time trying to solve those problems on behalf of our customers so that you don't have to worry about where does Defender for Endpoint fit in on my, one of my assessment practices for 3.14, for example. We have spent a lot of time helping you understand this is where this maps out and this is how we provide evidence to that fact. So Microsoft documentation, always for configuring a Microsoft product. There's a lot of great blogs out there, but I always default to the Microsoft documentation first. When it comes to CMMC specific, it really kind of depends on which assessment practice family you're looking at, or maybe even down to the specific objective that you're trying to solve for. I hope that answers your question. If not, please feel free to follow up with another.
There seems to be another question on top of that. So, in talking about those tools, what's the best way to prioritize which tools to be deployed first for compliance and risk reduction?
That's a really good question. Without trying to come up with a lame answer, I think it's subjective, and here's why. I am a security focused person first and foremost. So when I'm going up and setting up a new environment, or if I was setting up my environment, the very first thing I want to do is make sure that my environment is secure. I want to make sure that I'm getting log data, I'm monitoring the environment, I have tools in place to protect that environment, because as soon as my domain goes live, as there's an email address out there on the web, I now have a threat vector that someone can approach me from. So my priority is always going to be security first. Now let's solve for the compliance problem. Because especially when we're talking to customers who are coming into a Tesseract program, some of them might already have CUI, but they might not have GCC High yet. I want to set up that GCC High environment to bring them in before we're talking about a migration and bringing that data in. I want to set up that environment so that we are already monitoring it as we start doing migration activities to bring companies into GCC High. Because as soon as we start bringing people in, as soon as there's identities in the environment, really, we have a potential threat vector that a nation state or another malicious entity could use to exploit the environment. So my personal preference is always security first, and then start solving your compliance problem. Every MSSP is going to look at that a little bit different, or MSP is going to look at that a little different. But I would always say start with security first. Have Sentinel monitoring your environment, make sure it's connected with the different types of first party and third party connectors that are important to you. Make sure the Microsoft XDR is set up so we can protect against phishing, protect our cloud applications, protect our endpoints. And then let's start talking about bringing our data into the environment and protecting the data itself. Because if we're protecting the perimeter, if we're protecting the identity, the endpoint, the organization, and then we bring our data in and start worrying about how we're labeling that data, we have several layers of defense before we're starting to worry about where our data is and what's happening to it, right? If we can monitor for that activity first, then we can worry about this, the compliance piece on the back end. That's a personal preference for me, and that's how I go about solving problems with initial tenant configurations: is security first, secure the environment, bring in the or secure that perimeter, bring in the data, rather than bring in the data, worry about the compliance part or the data protection part, and then throw security around the perimeter. There's, to me, too much potential for error there. So personal preference. Cool. Anything else, Rich?
Good.
Awesome. All right, let's talk about the next one. This one's going to get a little bit more about the data protection piece. This is Microsoft Purview. So if you're looking for a tool that's going to let you label and classify and protect at the data level, Microsoft Purview is 100% the tool you're going to use, especially if you're in a Microsoft 365 environment. Some of those key features are information protection, data loss prevention, and then you have some auditing, e-discovery, and insider risk management. So when we start talking about information protection, this is the ability to classify data and then label that data and then take action on it, whether it's encryption, whether it's just protecting data flow, what have you. We have to know where our barriers are around our data that we have. If I have CUI, I want to be able to classify it either automatically or manually, depending on how that data is received and how consistent the format is. I want to be able, if I have to, I want to be able to manually label it as CUI. So if I'm producing a product that my prime or my DoD customer says that product you produce is CUI once you produce it, I need to be able to label it as such. And then I want to be able to control what happens with it. Does it need to be encrypted as soon as it's labeled? Is it, by virtue of being on SharePoint or on my endpoint, it's probably already done that. Do I need to control how that data flows out of my environment? If I'm sending something back to my prime, should CUI data only be allowed to go to my prime contractor or my DoD customer? And should only certain people be allowed to do that? Information protection coupled with data loss prevention is where you're going to say, this is the type of data I have. This is how I'm going to secure that data. This is how I'm going to prevent it from going anywhere I don't want it to go, whether it's an unmanaged endpoint, into a third-party application, or via email to an organization outside of mine, right? Whether that be my customer or someone else. And we're gonna have some real-world examples. We'll dive into this a little bit more further in the webinar, but I just want to hit on that point really quick. One of the features that Microsoft has worked really hard on, especially in this day and age of generative AI, There's so many Gen AI tools, and if you've worked around the DoD space for a little while, you're probably aware that some of those Gen AI tools that maybe were not made in the United States might be sending more information to the creator of that tool than you want them to have, and therefore it makes it unsafe to use. By having data loss prevention and information protection in place on our sensitive information like CUI, we can have that level of control saying it can't go out that way. You not only can we block access to the website, period. Maybe we don't want to do that entirely, but maybe we want to block the upload of files to that environment because that's outside of our organization. We can have that level of granular control to say this location that I want to upload to is not one of our approved locations for this data type. Therefore, here's an error. Here's an alert to go to the right person to let them know somebody tried this and it failed, but somebody tried. And maybe we need to have a discussion or do some training on why we need to keep data out of those areas, right? This really gets down to when we talk about CMMC is protecting and controlling the confidentiality of CUI, which is the kind of bread and butter of what CMMC is trying to accomplish. But when you get down to that data level, there's physical security, there's media protection, there's security monitoring. But when it really comes down to the data portion of this, really protecting the confidentiality and securing that CUI, this is where Microsoft Purview shines. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this. There's some very, very specific things that Microsoft Purview is going to help you accomplish. One of those is the media protection, and the other one is systems and communication protection. We talk about media protection, we think about where can that CUI live, whether it's on my endpoint, a hard drive, a flash drive, inside of my mailbox, wherever that media is, what happens to that CUI? Can it go there? We spend a lot of time helping organizations determine their use for removable media storage and whether or not they want to allow that at all, if they want to allow it in groups, and can CUI be stored there? In some cases, the answer there is no. I want to keep it in the cloud, and that's where it's going to live. We can help enable those kinds of functions. And then systems and communications protection. If I have CUI and I'm an authorized user of CUI and I need to deliver that, I want to make sure that I can only deliver it to a domain that has been approved for us to submit that CUI to. One of the, and I'm going to forget the practice family, but one of the practice families in CMMC is controlling and monitoring the flow of CUI inside of your environment. I need to be able to state, me as a contractor working for this DoD agency that's under, let's just for the sake of my background, say us.navy.mil. I should only be able to send CUI to us.navy.mil, not Gabe's Gmail account. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in one of the real world examples. We need to be able to protect where that information ends up. So we can set up automatic labeling so that when we don't have to worry about if CUI comes in or CUI gets stored somewhere, is it CUI? If it meets a format that we can create automatic labeling around, we can set the system up and set Purview up to say, this meets all of the requirements, the regular expressions that I identify as potentially being CUI. I'm going to label this. And therefore, now that it's labeled, only certain things can happen to it. Only certain people can use it. We can record any attempts for unauthorized access. So anybody who is not an authorized CUI user, perhaps you have some folks in HR who only handle personnel issues and don't need to manage any CUI, but try to go into one of your CUI SharePoint sites and access data. We're going to get, one, they're going to get blocked if they don't have access to that data label. And two, we're going to get records of that attempt to access data in an unauthorized way or share it or exfiltrate it. And all that becomes auditable activity. And then we can ensure that sensitive data remains within defined security boundaries. So if I need my data to stay in my tenant and only leave to us.navy.mil, we can define those restrictions so that any other location it tries to go to gets blocked. That's kind of Microsoft Purview in a nutshell. Rich, any questions before I move on?
Yeah, there was a question on the labeling inside of Purview. Is that automatically done? You answered that to a bit, but
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe there's maybe a little more detail that could be given that may give them an answer on how that's done, essentially.
Yeah, to kind of touch on that really quick. So Purview has the capability to automatically label sensitive information if you tell it to. One of the common hiccups with CUI is CUI comes in all sorts of formats. If you've worked in the government before and you've worked with different types of classified data, you know most of that data has a classification guide and so follows pretty strict formatting requirements, especially when we're talking about like Word documents or PDFs. So that's a little bit easier to identify when we're looking at the metadata of a document. CUI can come in all sorts of forms. So it really comes down to how are you receiving CUI? Is that information consistent in that way every time? Is it always coming in, for example, by a specific file type? Or is it always coming in a Word document with this specific heading? We can target that for automatic labeling. Another way to get around that, if we don't always have something consistent, is we can label an entire SharePoint site as being CUI, and therefore everything that's inside that SharePoint site inherits the data label and protection mechanisms that are in place by being a CUI SharePoint site. So yes, it's possible, and Microsoft handles tons of automatic labeling out of the box for different types of sensitive data. CUI being so broad in its category can be. It just really depends on how that data comes into you and would have to be analyzed a little bit. And that's something that we can absolutely help with. So I hope that answers your question. Please send a follow up if you have more questions for that. I'm gonna move forward just a little bit. I'm gonna try to buzz through a couple more so we can leave time for more Q&A. Some other items that we can use for security in CMMC, we touched on this earlier, but Microsoft Intune. So this is a mobile device management platform or MDM platform. It can also do mobile application management to configure, manage endpoints and access to Microsoft 365 applications. So if you're doing physical managed endpoints, virtual endpoints, or even allowing bring your own device or BYOD inside of your environment, Microsoft Intune has different formats to manage and configure devices and also manage access to different types of applications. Entra ID conditional access. So Entra ID is Microsoft's identity platform. If you have a Microsoft 365 environment, you have Entra ID because that's where your identity lives. Conditional access is the security portion of Microsoft Entra ID. Conditional access basically does the following. If you are trying to log into the tenant and you don't meet one or all of my predefined conditions, you are unable to log in or complete the action that you're trying to complete. Most of the time, we configure this around logging into the environment, but we also have session conditional access policies where, depending on what you're trying to access while you're logged in, it might trigger a conditional access policy. And if you're not don't meet the session requirement and you fail, you might be blocked from accessing a piece of data. Conditional access basically is if you don't meet the condition, you don't get access to the thing. Really common ones for conditional access is the requirement for multi-factor authentication. If you try to log in and try to skip multi-factor authentication, guess what? You can't log in. If you try to log in and you do pass multi-factor authentication, but maybe you have to be on a compliant managed device. If you're not on a compliant managed device, maybe you're not allowed to log in, or maybe that doesn't apply to you because you work on a government site. So maybe we're going to apply a session policy to you instead. Conditional access is a fantastic barrier to protect that initial access to your environment or initial access to data during a session. And then the last one is Defender for Cloud. If you use cloud infrastructure, if you use virtual machines, Kubernetes clusters, web application firewalls, or a variety of different infrastructure that Azure has to offer, Defender for Cloud is absolutely a tool that you're going to want to use. Not only is it going to make sure that your security posture for your cloud infrastructure is in place, it's going to help you identify vulnerabilities, identify misconfigurations in these different resources, do continuous monitoring. It also has a policy perspective. So if you have different policy requirements that you say, a virtual machine has to be configured in this way because we have a compliance requirement that it must meet these specific configurations, Defender for Cloud is going to monitor for those misconfigurations and even help you set up some remediative actions to help fix those problems. So just a couple of other tools that we can use. Unfortunately, we don't have a ton of time to dive into them, but if you have questions, please reach out. Let's talk about some real world examples for a second. So in this particular example, let's talk about phishing events. So this is going to bring in Defender for Office 365 as part of the Microsoft XDR suite to help reduce potential phishing emails. And let's say there's a new phishing campaign that's recently, quote unquote, hit the streets from a nation state advanced persistent threat or APT, and they're targeting government contractors in the defense industrial base. because you set up Defender for Office 365, and maybe all you stand up is the standard security preset inside of Office 365, which is absolutely something I recommend. Because Microsoft is consistently updating their indicators of compromise through their threat intelligence feeds, um, when you become a target of this phishing campaign, Defender for Office 365 has the ability to automatically categorize this as a phishing campaign and send it immediately to quarantine before that user even has the opportunity to interact with that email. You've now significantly improved the security posture of your environment by being able to automatically categorize and quarantine something that could have potentially been a very real threat to your environment if someone had just clicked the link when they weren't supposed to. Um, Phishing training, absolutely something you should do, but always trust but verify. Have Office 365, Defender for Office 365 set up to automatically quarantine and protect your environment from those potential phishing events. And then real world example number two is data loss prevention. Um, if you do set up data loss prevention and you set up CUI labeling for your secure environment, and say you only allow it to go to us.navy.mil, to use my previous example, what that's going to prevent is a new member of the team who wants to work on the document on the weekend from attempting to send this CUI specification that maybe you received from your customer to their personal email. The policy associated with that CUI label is going to prevent that document from being sent down to the organization's tenant to this unauthorized domain, and also alert administrators to say, hey, somebody tried to send this to their Gmail account. Maybe that's an insider risk. Maybe it's just a training problem. Let's go and address that issue. So we have two very real world examples where this can kind of come into play. To kind of wrap up here, some key takeaways, right? CMMC compliance is 100% a journey, right? And the GCC High is an excellent enclave for your journey in CMMC compliance. State-of-the-art cybersecurity tools that you can keep your organization safe and aiding compliance as well. Tools like Sentinel, Microsoft XDR, Microsoft Purview can ensure your organization has the tools to proactively mitigate threats, react to new activity, and safeguard critical data from improper use and dissemination. We do have some next steps. Long story short, get in touch with us. Reach out to marketing@ardalyst.com. One of our team members is going to reach out also following this if you have any other additional questions, and make sure all your questions got answered. But I do want to open up to some additional questions that anybody might have about what we've talked about today or anything related to the Tesseract program. Rich, what do we got? I kind of lost to the end of that.
Yeah, no, it's all good. We do have a couple questions here. Starting off, first question, how does these tools compare to what my MSP or MSSP is already providing me today?
Yeah, I think the long story short there is if your MSSP is providing monitoring, one of the biggest comparisons that I would say is are you paying for a third-party tool? Are you paying your MSSP to go and use another third-party tool when these native tools are already built into your environment and very much can be leveraged by an MSSP? We leverage it every single day for 60 plus customers, right? If you're paying for a third-party tool or an MSSP to go and use third-party tools when all of these first-party tools are native and built in, I think that's kind of the big differentiator here is instead of having to go and connect a bunch of third-party associations, we have everything that's built in a tenant that you already own that can be configured and leveraged to protect your environment without needing any other third-party tools to come in and do that monitoring for you, right? So I think that's a big question: is what is your MSP providing, and are you having to pay them to go and implement these third-party tools when these first-party tools are just as good, if not better, and are already built into an environment that you own. Therefore, the data, the logging, all of the auditing exists inside of your environment and belongs to you and doesn't go and live in some third-party MSSP's environment. So I think that would be a big question to ask. To answer a question with a question is, what are you paying for? What are you getting? And why aren't you using why aren't you using your first-party tools that belong inside your environment with your log data? So to me, I'm sensitive to if I'm going to help you, I want to help you inside of your environment. I want to make sure you're leveraging your tools and not try to say, let me just collect all this log data and put it inside of my tools, because then for a CMMC assessment, you have to consider, how do I expose you inside of an assessment? If everything lives inside of your environment and the logging happens there, and I just come in and monitor your existing environment, I think that's a little better. What else?
Okay, great. Next question is coming in. I think somebody heard you mention Tesseract a couple times. Uh, they say here, how does Ardalyst's Tesseract solution help configure and maintain these tools over time?
Sure. I love that question. So one of the things that Tesseract is going to do, first off, during an initial environment configuration, we're going to make sure that Sentinel is set up. We're going to make sure that all the critical logs that you have in your environment are coming into log analytics, so Sentinel can analyze that data. We're also going to make sure that the Microsoft XDR is configured to catch a wide array of these potentially malicious activity that create obvious exposures in your environment. One of the ways that Tesseract continuously monitors that is, we use a function called Azure Lighthouse, where we can monitor your Sentinel instance without having to bring your data inside of our tenant, right? So we get full ability to monitor that environment over time and continuously improve that monitoring without having to ingest your data outside of your environment. Everything gets to live inside of your tenant. To kind of go back to my previous question, right? So one of the things that we are continuously doing is, one, reviewing new threats, new vulnerabilities, and we are adjusting Sentinel and adjusting the Microsoft XDR, as is Microsoft, as they're doing all of their threat research and bringing in all of their new data to improve their tools. We're improving it from our end as well to make sure that we're staying abreast of what are the common issues that are potentially affecting our customers, whether they're customers who work in the defense industrial base and comply with CMMC, or our commercial customers who just are looking for a good security program. We are continuously updating our analytics rules, our alert criteria, our monitoring, our continuous compliance platforms to make sure that all of these tools are working in your favor and not only keeping you safe, but also proving your compliance with CMMC level 2. I hope that answers your question. If not, we'll definitely follow up with you.
Oh, that's good. I think we got time for one more question.
Sure.
This question is about Compliance Manager. The question is, how does Microsoft's Compliance Manager work in GCC High, and how reliable are the built-in assessments?
Gotcha. So Compliance Manager is a function of Microsoft Purview. So Microsoft Purview's Compliance Manager allows you to select a wide array of compliance frameworks and have it take a look at your tenant and try to determine if you are complying with that compliance framework. The problem with CMMC and the Compliance Manager, and problems may be a strong word, is there's Microsoft's view of CMMC, the Tesseract view of CMMC, insert vendor here's view of CMMC. There are a lot of different interpretations of how CMMC can be adhered to. The Compliance Manager is a very opinionated way of complying with CMMC that is going or informing you of how you might be complying with CMMC, because it's not going to force you to do anything. But if you were to go and implement all of the requirements of CMMC per the Compliance Manager, that might be something counterintuitive to how your organization does business. So one of the really important things that I like to think of with Compliance Manager is it's a good guideline. If you're implementing CMMC on your own, maybe go look at the Compliance Manager, see what recommendations it's making, and determine, is this a recommendation that I can make with my business and not impede operations? Or is this going to really impact and require a lot of extra user training on how we do business because it's putting me into a stricter box than I need to be in? Compliance Manager, I think, is a fantastic guideline. I do not think it is an end-all, be-all source to get you to compliance. It also doesn't take into consideration certain things like physical security controls, media protection, anything where you might have physical media, paper, hard drives, etc., inside of your office, or firewalls or anything like that. It doesn't consider any of that. It's only looking at the compliant environment versus the way the Tesseract talks about compliance is we're looking at your program holistically throughout the entire organization. We're going to talk about on-prem. We're going to talk about your on-premise network, how you're handling physical and digital media, and also how you're complying inside of your cloud environment, and try to mold that to meet your business where your business is at, rather than force your business to be inside of what we think is correct.
Okay. Oh, great. Thank you for that, Gabe. It looks like we've hit time, and we've concluded today's session. If we didn't get to your question, one of the Ardalyst representatives will reach out to you to get you an answer directly. We'll be sending out follow-up emails after this of the webinar recording. And other helpful resources on the topics that we covered here today. If you have any additional questions or need information, please feel free to reach out to us at marketing@ardalyst.com, and we'll be happy to assist you in what you need. If you are looking for more information on Ardalyst and our services, please visit us online at www.ardalyst.com.